Usually when we look back at historical tragedies, we desperately want to find a clean, jagged line on the X-ray,
Right.
a singular fracture we can point to, a singularly corrupt king, or, a sudden famine, a specific boundary dispute. We want that clean line because it's legible. It tells us exactly what broke and why.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It is deeply comforting to view history as a series of isolated, identifiable mechanical failures.
Yeah.
We want to believe that if we just remove that one bad actor or, resolve that one border dispute, the whole system just goes back to functioning normally.
But when you look at the phenomenon of the Crusades, which is this staggering sequence of holy wars spanning from the late 11th to the late 13th century, that X-ray is terrifyingly murky.
Very much so.
You aren't looking at a single broken bone. You're looking at a complete systemic mutation of the human operating system. So today we're doing a deep dive, and we have a fascinating document in front of us simply titled The Crusades.pdf.
It's a great read.
It really is. And rather than just giving us a dry chronological list of troop movements and medieval kings, this text serves as a psychological, structural, and philosophical autopsy of an era.
That's a great way to put it.
Thanks. Our mission today is to unpack the incredibly volatile intersection of religion, politics, and identity in this text. It asks a chilling question, which is, what actually happens to a society when human belief completely overrides moral hesitation?
And that framing is essential. The author refuses to dismiss the Crusades as some bizarre, irrational anomaly of the Dark Ages.
Right.
That is a very common trap, looking
Yeah.
back at the 11th century and assuming these people were just fundamentally less evolved or less rational than we are today.
Exactly. We tend to think, oh, they just didn't know better.
But instead, the text views the crusading movement as a massive historical magnification of a very specific and very enduring human tendency. The text calls it epistemic closure.
I want to linger on that term because it anchors everything we are going to discuss today, epistemic closure. That's when a system, whether that's a medieval religious institution, a modern political party, or even like a tight-knit digital community, reaches a point where it claims absolute truth, absolute moral authority, and exclusive legitimacy.
And the mechanism of epistemic closure is what makes it so incredibly dangerous. Once a system locks into those three claims, any alternative perspective is no longer viewed as merely factually incorrect.
Yeah, it's not just a disagreement.
No, it is viewed as an existential contagion. Different viewpoints aren't met with debate. They are met with an urgent need for eradication.
Wow.
The text points out that in a state of absolute epistemic closure, the very concept of violence transforms. It is reframed. Cruelty is stripped of its moral weight and redressed as a sacred, purifying duty.
The text has a terrifying way of phrasing this. It says that in this state, doubt is treated as treason.
Yes.
The entire spectrum of human identity is forcibly flattened into a brutal binary. You are either faithful or you are a heretic. You are saved or you are condemned.
There is no middle ground.
None at all. And we are going to explore exactly how that binary was constructed and enforced. But before we get into the mechanics of this 900-year-old conflict, I want to make our parameters very clear for you, the listener.
Good idea.
This source material deals with deeply sensitive religious concepts, staggering political violence, and profound historical trauma involving Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Our goal today is entirely analytical and impartial.
Absolutely.
We are not here to take sides. We are not endorsing the theological or political viewpoints discussed in the text, and we are certainly not litigating the grievances of a millennium ago. We are simply exploring the profound structural ideas contained within this specific source material to understand how systems of belief function under pressure.
It is a vital boundary to set. We are dissecting the architecture of a historical phenomenon. We are looking at the blueprint of a machine that manufactured certainty and examining how that certainty generated catastrophic friction.
So to understand how a machine like that gets built, you have to look at the environment that necessitated it.
You do.
The overarching myth is that the Crusades were just a spontaneous eruption of pious zeal. Just boom, suddenly everyone wants to go to war for God.
Right, out of nowhere.
But the text paints a picture of 11th century Europe that was vibrating with an almost apocalyptic level of internal stress. It wasn't a serene realm of quiet monasteries, it was a pressure cooker.
The material realities of pre-Crusade Europe were defined by intense, overlapping crises.
Tell me about those.
Well, first you have the social and economic friction caused by feudal fragmentation.
Oh, okay.
Europe was not a collection of stable, centralized nation-states with defined borders and standing armies like we think of today. It was highly localized, deeply hierarchical, and intensely fractured.
Like everyone was in their own little bubble.
Yes, and authority was decentralized down to the level of local lords and barons who were basically in a state of constant low-level warfare with one another over resources.
And those resources were shrinking relative to the population. The text highlights that Europe was experiencing a significant demographic expansion. You have more and more people, but, well, the amount of arable land is finite.
Exactly.
And this tension is exacerbated exponentially by the inheritance system of primogeniture, which I found super interesting.
Primogeniture is the crucial economic mechanism here. It is the legal practice where the eldest son inherits the entire family estate.
The land, the titles, everything.
The wealth, everything. The intention was to prevent family holdings from being endlessly subdivided into uselessly small parcels over generations.
Which makes sense on paper.
It does, but it created a massive unintended sociological consequence.
It created an entire generation of younger sons from the nobility who inherited absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
No land, no income, no future within the traditional feudal structure, but they possessed one highly specific, highly dangerous asset.
A lifetime of elite military training.
Right. The text refers to these landless knights with this incredibly stark phrase. It says they were overproduced instruments of violence.
It is a perfect economic description. Society had manufactured a massive surplus of heavy cavalry, highly trained, heavily armored men whose entire identity and utility were predicated on warfare. But it had no internal mechanism to absorb them.
They had no outlet.
None. If a society produces thousands of idle warriors who are desperate for land and status and gives them no external enemy, they will inevitably turn their violence inward. They were literally going to tear the localized European economy apart.
Think of 11th century Europe as a massive industrial engine.
Okay, I like this.
You've got these huge pistons firing, and that's the population growth. You've got combustible fuel sloshing around, which is the economic scarcity and the localized desperation for land.
Right.
So this massive engine is just revving and revving, generating all this violent energy, but there is no transmission. The wheels aren't connected to anything. You just have this localized warrior class with nothing to do but brutalize their immediate neighbors over a tiny strip of farmland. The engine is vibrating so violently that it is on the verge of shaking itself to pieces.
That mechanical analogy perfectly captures the internal socioeconomic threat. But then you have to layer the political instability directly on top of that vibrating engine.
The church, right?
Yes. The centralized authority of the Church, specifically the papacy under Pope Urban II, was not the absolute, unquestioned monolith we often imagine it to be in medieval times.
Wait, really? Because I always pictured the Pope back then as having absolute control.
Not at all. The papacy was actually in a state of profound political vulnerability. They had just endured a massive systemic shock known as the investiture controversy.
This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Let's dig into that.
The investiture controversy essentially fractured the relationship between secular rulers, the kings and emperors of Europe, and the papal authority.
Right.
It was a bitter existential fight over who actually had the right to appoint local church officials and bishops.
And that wasn't just a squabble over titles. I mean, it was a battle for the fundamental control of wealth and social infrastructure across Europe.
Exactly. It left the papacy politically isolated and deeply contested. Power across the continent was diffuse, antagonistic, and chaotic. Pope Urban was operating from a position of relative weakness.
So he's backed into a corner.
He is. He desperately needed a unifying cause, a grand strategic initiative that could bypass the secular kings and directly assert his moral and political leadership over these fractious, violent elites.
He needs a way to prove that the spiritual authority of the church supersedes the secular authority of the local kings.
Yes.
And then, as if perfectly timed by history, a literal cry for help arrives from the east.
The catalyst.
Yeah.
The Byzantine Empire, centered in the magnificent city of Constantinople, represents the eastern half of the Christian world. But they are facing an existential military crisis of their own.
The Seljuk Empire.
Right. They are under immense sustained pressure from the Seljuks, a rapidly expanding and powerful Muslim dynasty that has been systematically pushing into Byzantine territory in Anatolia.
So the Byzantine emperor, Alexios I, sends an envoy to Western Europe. He essentially says, look, we are fellow Christians, our borders are collapsing, and we need military assistance. Send us mercenary forces to help push back the Seljuks.
Now, the author of the text makes a brilliant analytical distinction here that we have to map out for the listener. They separate the mechanics of this historical moment into three distinct categories.
Okay, what are they?
The trigger, the fuel, and the oxygen.
Okay, let's break those down. The Byzantine request is the trigger.
Correct.
It is the immediate geopolitical spark. But as we know, a trigger doesn't do anything on its own.
Yeah.
You can pull the trigger on an empty chamber all day long and nothing happens.
Exactly. The trigger requires fuel. And the fuel is everything we just examined.
All that pressure.
It is the centuries of simmering religious tension. It is the severe economic pressure of finite land. It is the overproduced, landless younger sons desperate for status.
Yeah.
It is the fractured political landscape and a pope desperate to consolidate authority. The Byzantine emperor asked for a localized mercenary force, but he accidentally gave that massive, vibrating European engine a transmission.
He gave all that internal pressure a defined external direction.
Precisely.
But even a trigger and a massive reservoir of fuel aren't enough to sustain a fire of this magnitude for 2 centuries. To create a conflagration that burns across generations, you need oxygen.
In this historical autopsy, the oxygen is the theology.
The oxygen is the precise theological framing that takes all of this socioeconomic desperation, all of this geopolitical opportunism, and magically transforms the resulting violence into a profound spiritual virtue.
Yes. The call for a crusade offered an incredibly elegant, multi-layered solution to the European crisis.
It really did.
It took the internal, destructive violence of Latin Christendom, exported it thousands of miles away, offered the landless knights a chance at unimaginable wealth and status, and simultaneously elevated the Pope to the role of supreme commander of a unified Christian army.
It is stunning to look at the sheer alignment of these forces. When we read history, massive events often feel entirely inevitable. We look back and think, well, of course the Crusades happened.
Right, like it was destiny.
But the text is very careful to avoid determinism. The Crusades weren't physically inevitable. It's just that when you take a vast surplus of violence, combine it with a desperate institutional need for political unity, offer massive material incentives, and then crown the entire enterprise with the absolute moral authorization of God.
War simply stops being one of many political options.
Exactly. It ceases to be a choice. Within that specific medieval worldview, it begins to feel like the only coherent, rational response available to society.
Action, belief, and social structure all lock together, pointing in the exact same direction. When a system achieves that level of alignment, it requires an almost superhuman leap of imagination for any individual inside that system to step outside the dominant narrative and question the morality of the enterprise.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism of that moral authorization. We have a pressurized society, we have the trigger, and we have the fuel. But how do you actually convince tens of thousands of people, peasants who've never left their village, knights who have only ever fought their cousins? How do you convince them to pack up their lives and walk 3,000 miles to wage war in a desert they have never seen?
It's a huge ask.
You can't just post a flyer saying the Byzantine emperor is hiring mercenaries. You have to fundamentally re-engineer the definition of the violence itself.
And that profound psychological re-engineering takes place in November of 1095 at the Council of Clermont. Pope Urban doesn't just stand up and call for a defensive military campaign to aid an ally. He completely redefines the metaphysical nature of the expedition. He frames it as an armed pilgrimage.
An armed pilgrimage. Just sitting with those 2 words, the cognitive dissonance is staggering.
It really is.
A pilgrimage is traditionally an act of profound humility, of penance, of seeking spiritual purification through hardship. To attach the word armed to it, to fuse the mechanics of warfare with the mechanics of spiritual salvation, is a massive ideological mutation.
It is a radical theological shift. The text notes that Christian theology already had established frameworks for justified violence.
Right, like just war theory.
Exactly. Thinkers like Augustine of Hippo had developed the just war theory centuries earlier, which essentially outlined the strict, unfortunate conditions under which a Christian ruler could engage in violence to protect the innocent or restore peace.
But it was still viewed as a tragic necessity, right?
Yeah.
A consequence of a fallen world.
Correct. In just war theory, you might be legally justified in killing an enemy soldier. But the act of killing still carries a spiritual weight. It is still a shedding of blood that requires some level of spiritual reckoning or penance afterward.
But Claremont changes the math entirely. The Crusades push past just war theory into a completely new paradigm, which the text calls penitential warfare.
Penitential warfare.
Yeah.
This is the conceptual oxygen that sustains the entire era. The institution of the church introduces the concept of the indulgence for those who participate.
Which is what exactly?
An indulgence is the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin. The papacy essentially declares that the physical hardship of the journey, combined with the act of fighting the designated enemies of the faith, acts as a supreme penance.
Wow.
It cleanses the soul.
Wow.
It is explicitly stated that death in this specific battle guarantees immediate salvation and entry into heaven.
I am trying to truly grasp the psychological gravity of this shift. If you are a medieval peasant, your entire life is defined by the fear of damnation. Your worldview is entirely structured around sin, punishment, and the desperate hope for grace.
Right.
You have been taught your entire life that thou shalt not kill. And suddenly, the supreme moral authority on earth, the direct representative of the divine, tells you that the rules of the universe have temporarily shifted, that killing is no longer a sin you must desperately try to atone for.
It goes even further than that. Killing, in this highly specific, highly managed context, becomes the exact mechanism by which you achieve grace.
That is wild.
It is a complete inversion of harm. The text points out how deeply unsettling this is. Harm becomes virtue. The act of destroying another human being is reframed as an act of profound spiritual productivity.
The source text has this incredibly haunting line to describe this state. It says, "Truth drowned beneath their holy fire." It highlights how epistemic closure utterly short-circuits the human conscience. Because when an institution absorbs the moral hazard of violence, the individual is freed from the psychological burden of guilt. You outsource your conscience to the system.
Exactly.
You aren't committing murder. You are simply an instrument executing divine justice.
And the system compensates you for your obedience by entirely removing your existential anxiety about death and hell. It is an incredibly potent, incredibly dangerous psychological contract.
I can imagine.
But the text points out the terrifying, inevitable consequence of building this kind of theological machinery. Once a society develops a robust, functional grammar of sanctified violence, once it learns how to label an enemy as sacredly opposed and successfully marshals its population to destroy them, that grammar refuses to stay confined to its original target.
The violence becomes recursive.
Precisely. The ideological framework constructed to justify a war against Muslims in the distant Levant was far too politically useful to leave on the shelf.
Of course.
Very quickly, the papacy and secular rulers realized they could point this exact same theological weapon inward. It was used to launch internal crusades against heretical Christian sects in Europe, like the brutal Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France.
So they just turned the weapon on themselves.
Yes, it was weaponized against the political rivals of the papacy. It was used against peasant uprisings.
So the overarching narrative of the Crusades as a grand binary clash of civilizations between East and West is fundamentally flawed. It was also an internal mechanism.
It was.
It was a tool used by a specific system, Latin Christendom, to violently police its own ideological borders and enforce absolute uniformity at home. If you disagreed with the Pope's political aims, you weren't just a rival. You could be declared a heretic, and an armed pilgrimage could be called against your doorstep.
It demonstrates how epistemic closure demands perpetual purification. A system built on absolute certainty cannot tolerate even minor deviations. The violence wasn't just pointing east, it was constantly circling back, consuming anyone who didn't fit the incredibly narrow definition of the faithful.
It is deeply sobering to realize that this isn't just medieval history. The author of the text explicitly connects the structural logic of 1095 to the way human beings operate today.
The hardware of the human brain hasn't changed in a millennium.
No, it hasn't. Look at how modern political factions function. Look at deeply insulated online communities.
Oh, exactly.
Look at how rapidly a group will demand unquestioned loyalty, how quickly they will label any nuance or compromise as an existential threat. When a modern group flattens the complexity of the world into us, the pure, and them, the condemned, they are running the exact same software that birthed the Crusades.
It's the same pattern.
The weapons are different, the scale is different, but the psychological blueprint of epistemic closure is identical.
We are always susceptible to the alluring comfort of outsourcing our conscience to a system that promises us we are absolutely right and our opponents are absolutely evil. It relieves us of the exhausting burden of critical thinking.
But let's strip away the grand theology for a moment. We have analyzed the macroeconomics, the papal strategies, the structural psychology. Now, I want to bring this analysis down to the dirt.
The physical reality.
Exactly. Because theology is abstract, but war is intensely physical. What did it practically, physically, and emotionally feel like to be inside the machinery of this specific conflict? Because we cannot project our modern understanding of warfare onto the 11th century.
We absolutely cannot. The sheer scale of the geography involved is staggering, especially when you consider the technology of movement available.
Right. No trains or planes.
The text emphasizes that this was fundamentally a journey war. You have tens of thousands of combatants and non-combatants originating in the cold rains, the dense, muddy forests, and the temperate farmlands of Western Europe. They must march, literally, walk, step by step, or ride horses if they're wealthy enough, across the entire European continent. They have to traverse the rugged, unforgiving, and dangerously dry plateaus of Anatolia.
And if they survive that, they finally reach the Levant. Cities like Antioch and Jerusalem. An entirely alien environment of arid hills, blinding dust, oppressive heat, and massive ancient stone fortifications.
It's a huge shock.
They are marching into an ecological reality they have absolutely no biological or cultural preparation for.
Think about the defining characteristic of this experience isn't just the violence. It is the absolute agonizing slowness of the endeavor.
Slowness, that's a great word for it.
Modern warfare can be terrifyingly instantaneous. It is often characterized by extreme distance and sudden push-button devastation, a drone strike initiated from a console a hemisphere away.
Right.
But the Crusades were the exact opposite. A journey war means you march for months, sometimes years, before you ever see the enemy. War was not just fought in brief, terrifying clashes. It was endured as a daily, grinding reality.
The endurance is hard to conceptualize. The sheer logistical nightmare of trying to feed an army of 60,000 people and their horses as they walk across a hostile, arid landscape. The text makes it clear that starvation wasn't just an unfortunate accident, it was a constant hovering presence.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the Crusaders were drinking horse blood to survive in Anatolia. Furthermore, disease in the cramped, unsanitary, slowly moving encampments killed vastly more people than Muslim arrows or swords ever did. You are dealing with dysentery, typhus, and profound malnutrition.
And you are dealing with profound isolation. You are surrounded by a linguistic tower of Babel French, German, Norman, Italian, trying to coordinate a massive movement through lands where no one speaks your language.
That sounds chaotic.
It was.
Yeah.
And you carry the immense psychological weight of being impossibly far from home in an era where long-distance communication is virtually non-existent. Once you leave France, you effectively cease to exist to the people back home until you return years later, if you return at all.
And when the violence finally did happen, it was characterized by an agonizingly slow tempo. The dominant form of warfare in this era wasn't the open field battle. It was the siege.
Siege, yes.
The text specifically highlights the siege of Antioch. We are talking about an army surrounding massive stone walls and sitting there for months on end. It is a suffocating stillness.
Siege warfare is a war of attrition. It is a race to see who starves first. Starvation was weaponized by both the besiegers outside the walls, who rapidly depleted the surrounding countryside, and the besieged inside, who watched their granaries empty.
Just a terrible waiting game.
Exactly. Disease would run completely unchecked through the densely packed civilian population inside the city and through the squalid crusader camps outside. It is months of waiting, watching, and weakening.
But that suffocating stillness is occasionally punctuated by sudden, overwhelming, and terrifyingly intimate brutality. When the walls are breached or when an open field battle does occur, it is a chaos of close-quarter slaughter, heavy cavalry charges by armored knights crashing into infantry lines.
It's deeply personal.
Yeah, you aren't shooting at a pixel on a screen. You're looking directly into the eyes of the human being. You're striking down with a heavy iron broadsword or a battle axe. You feel the physical resistance of their bones breaking.
The physical intimacy of the combat is matched by the weight of the technology. The European forces are draped in chainmail hauberks, thousands of interlocking iron rings that weigh incredibly heavily on the shoulders and trap the desert heat.
That sounds miserable.
They carry massive, heavy wooden shields. The Muslim forces they encounter are utilizing highly advanced composite bows that can pierce armor at range, while the European armies increasingly rely on the brutal, mechanical stopping power of the crossbow. You have massive wooden siege towers creaking forward on wooden wheels, the rhythmic booming impact of battering rams against stone gates. It is a profoundly physical, heavy, exhausting kind of violence.
The author of the text translates this structural reality into sensory language in a way that is just mesmerizing.
The descriptions are incredible.
Visually, you have to imagine the constant choking dust rising endlessly under tens of thousands of marching feet. You have the harsh, unforgiving Mediterranean sunlight reflecting blindingly off thousands of metal helmets and spear tips.
Right.
You see the vibrant colors of heraldic banners moving slowly in a dry, hot wind, and constantly looming on the horizon the massive, impassive stone walls of ancient cities.
And sonically, the text describes a layered soundscape. Underneath everything is the constant low murmur of a massive organism in motion. The clinking of iron rings, the snorting and screaming of horses, the heavy thud of footsteps.
The sound of endurance.
Exactly. You hear the collective, rhythmic chanting of prayers being spoken aloud by thousands of exhausted, terrified men trying to maintain their epistemic closure. And then, that low drone is violently ruptured by the terrifying blast of war horns, the chaotic screaming, the sickening metallic crash of steel on steel.
And then, the text notes, it is followed by an emptied silence. Not a peaceful silence, the silence of a space that has been drained of life.
Emptied.
Emptied. It is a profound word choice. The author includes these fascinating musical references to anchor the emotional reality of this landscape. They mention a track called Epitaph of the Olbaid to represent the sheer, grinding feeling of history being written through raw, unforgiving violence.
Okay, yes.
And then they contrast it with a track called Oh, Lamb of God, which is meant to represent the agonizing paradox of the Crusaders' mind. How profound, transcendent devotion and crippling, existential doubt can exist in the exact same breath, in the exact same person.
That tension is the core of the lived experience.
Hmm.
Because of the slowness of the journey, because of the lack of centralized communication and the incredibly fragile supply lines, the entire war effort relied on trust, blind faith, and constant desperate improvisation.
It's like embarking on a grueling, multi-year road trip through the desert, but you are carrying 70 pounds of iron gear, you are chronically starving, you are plagued by dysentery, and you know that at the end of the road, you will either have to kill a stranger or be hacked to death yourself.
It's unimaginable.
The sheer duration of that journey gives a human mind endless, agonizing hours every single day to think. You have months to stare at the horizon and believe deeply, fervently in your divine mission. And then you have months to suddenly doubt absolutely everything, to desperately try and justify your suffering, to wonder if God has abandoned you.
But daily reality for a crusader was not a constant glowing state of triumphant holy zeal. That is the myth.
A total myth.
The reality was a grinding tension of dissonance. It was an exhausting, gritty negotiation between the sacred promises of the Pope and the profane reality of starvation and blood. The author condenses this entire agonizing sensory and psychological experience into one haunting, poetic image. Iron crossing unfamiliar sunlight.
Iron crossing unfamiliar sunlight. That phrase alone justifies the entire deep dive. But that image forces us to ask a crucial question. We know what the physical environment felt like, but who exactly was standing in that unfamiliar sunlight? We are moving into the reality of the crowded field.
Yes, the crowded field.
Because the myth we are all fed in grade school is that the Crusades were a simple, binary contest. Team Europe versus Team Middle East, Christianity versus Islam. But this source text forcefully and meticulously dismantles that myth. The field was a chaotic, fragmented mess.
It was incredibly fractured. Let's examine the Latin Christian Crusaders first. They were absolutely not a monolith acting with singular purpose. No, you had incredibly wealthy, powerful Norman and Frankish nobles whose primary motivation was carving out new, independent principalities for themselves in the East to rule as kings.
Okay, so personal gain.
Right. And they were marching right alongside desperately impoverished peasants who had sold everything they owned, genuinely believing that reaching Jerusalem was the only way to save their souls from hell. You had highly professional, heavily armed knights operating next to untrained, starving mobs.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was. They were organized loosely at best, and the noble leaders were in a state of constant, bitter, treacherous competition with one another for resources, glory, and control of captured cities.
And then you have the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Christianity. They are the ones who initiated this whole sequence of events by asking the Pope for help. But culturally, linguistically, and even theologically, they are vastly distinct from the Western Europeans.
The Byzantines did not view the arriving Crusader armies as long-lost brothers in arms. They viewed them as a massive, unwashed, and highly dangerous barbarian horde.
Oh, wow.
The emperor asked for a manageable, professional mercenary force to plug a hole in his border defenses. Instead, he received an uncontrollable, zealous mass migration of hundreds of thousands of armed fanatics who had no intention of taking orders from Constantinople.
Which immediately sets the stage for immense distrust, broken oaths, and eventual betrayal. And if we look across the battlefield to the Islamic world, the situation is equally, if not more, fragmented. There was no single, unified Muslim side at the arrival of the First Crusade.
The political landscape of the Middle East in the late 11th century was defined by deep internal division. You had the Seljuk Turks controlling Anatolia and parts of Syria.
The ones the Byzantines were worried about.
Exactly. They were militarily formidable but politically decentralized, functioning more as a loose confederation of rival warlords. And for the south, controlling Egypt and occasionally Jerusalem, you had the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty that was a bitter ideological and political rival to the Sunni Seljuks.
So the Fatimids and the Seljuks hated each other. In fact, the text notes that at various points, the Fatimids viewed the arriving Crusaders not as an existential threat to Islam, but as a potentially useful geopolitical ally to help them weaken the Seljuks.
Yes, exactly.
It's a massive, multi-factional free-for-all. It isn't until decades later, under leaders like Nur ad-Din and eventually Saladin, that you see a consolidated Muslim resistance successfully framing the conflict as a unified jihad, a defense of the Islamic world against the Western invaders.
But beyond the men holding the swords, the text brings our attention to the overlooked actors, the groups who are entirely left out of the glorious binary narratives of holy war and whose experiences are truly heartbreaking.
The Jewish communities of Europe.
Yes, they became the very first casualties of the crusading fervor. As these massive, zealous armies mobilized in regions like the Rhineland in Germany, the logic of epistemic closure took hold before they ever marched east.
This part is so grim.
It is. The Crusaders reasoned, why march 3,000 miles to fight the enemies of Christ when we have communities of non-believers right here in our own cities?
Wow.
The result was horrific, localized pogroms. Jewish communities were violently massacred by the very system that had just redefined who belonged and who was an existential enemy.
You also have to look at the local Eastern Christians living in the Levant Greek Orthodox, Armenian Syriac Christians. These communities had lived under Islamic rule for centuries, generally maintaining a complex but functional coexistence.
Wow.
They shared a foundational religion with the Crusaders, but absolutely no cultural or linguistic identity. When the Western armies arrived, these local Christians were frequently caught right in the crossfire. Their cities were besieged, their lives upended, and they were often treated with deep suspicion by the Crusaders, who couldn't understand why these people didn't worship exactly as they did in Rome.
And finally, you have the opportunists, the ultimate pragmatists of the era, the Italian maritime republics, most notably Venice and Genoa.
Venice and Genoa looking at a catastrophic holy war and seeing nothing but dollar signs.
They were not primarily driven by theological fervor. They looked at the massive logistical nightmare of moving armies across the Mediterranean and recognized sheer economic opportunity.
They saw a market.
They possessed the naval infrastructure. They provided the ships, the transport, the naval blockades, and the vital supply lines. And in exchange, they extracted massive concessions. They demanded exclusive trading quarters in conquered cities, tariff exemptions, and outright control of key ports. They leveraged the zealous warfare of others to build highly durable, centuries-long commercial empires.
I am trying to synthesize this tangled mess. If you have a Venetian merchant solely focused on securing a spice monopoly, a starving French peasant desperately trying to earn forgiveness for his sins, a Byzantine official trying to protect his local borders from Turks, and a Norman knight trying to carve out a new kingdom in Antioch. And they are all nominally marching under the same banner, wearing the same cross. Are they even fighting the same war?
That is perhaps the most vital analytical question you can ask about any historical conflict. And the answer the text provides is profoundly illuminating. No, they're absolutely not fighting the same war.
Not at all.
The Crusades were not a singular event. They were a convergence of intensely distinct inner worlds colliding under immense external pressure. Every single demographic and every individual within those groups sincerely believed their internal narrative was the coherent, justified reality.
The text breaks down these colliding inner worlds into three broad categories of lived experience: the soldiers, the civilians, and the leaders. Let's look at the soldier first.
For the soldier on the ground, The daily reality is a suffocating blend of fear, physical exhaustion, and an absolute reliance on the brotherhood of the men immediately beside them. Their inner tension is profound. They are constantly caught between the high ideals of devotion and the brutal mechanics of survival.
The author perfectly articulates this dissonance. A soldier might wake up looking at the sunrise over the desert, hearing the morning prayers, and feel an overwhelming sense of sacred purpose. He believes his mission is ordained by God. But that same soldier goes to sleep that night, covered in the blood and viscera of another human being, shivering in a mud-soaked tent, listening to his friends die of dysentery. And he stares at the dark ceiling wondering, if I am doing the work of God, why does it feel like this? Why is it so profoundly ugly?
It's a massive contradiction.
They are forced to negotiate the meaning of their actions against the sheer brutality of their environment every single day.
Now compare that to the inner world of the civilian. The civilian experiences the war entirely through the lens of powerlessness. They possess no agency. For a farmer in Syria or a weaver in a besieged city, the grand theological debates of the Pope are entirely irrelevant.
They don't care about the theology.
For them, war is simply the sudden disruption of the grain supply. It is skyrocketing prices. It is a foreign army systematically looting their winter stores. It is the constant, terrifying shifting of armed rulers demanding taxes.
They aren't choosing the war. They are merely the terrain upon which the war is fought. They absorb the devastating consequences. Their entire understanding of the conflict is filtered through rumor, heavy religious propaganda from the local clerics, and the raw biological imperative to keep their children from starving.
And finally, you have the inner world of the leaders. The kings, the high nobles, the popes, the emperors. They occupy a reality of total abstraction.
They are looking at maps in comfortable rooms.
Exactly.
They are negotiating alliances, managing supply lines, dealing with troop numbers on parchment. The physical consequences of their decisions, the blood, the starvation, are entirely delayed and separated from them.
Yet they operate under a deeply compressed psychological urgency. They have to balance their immediate political legitimacy, keeping their rival lords happy, with an immense, terrifying burden of symbolic responsibility.
A heavy crown.
Yes. A king or a crusade leader thinks, if I hesitate, if I retreat, I'm failing God and will be damned. But if I push forward and this army is destroyed, I lose my entire kingdom and the political stability of my realm. It is an abstract terror, but it is absolute.
The ultimate tragedy of this crowded field is that all these people were negotiating their own internal identities, their own economic desperation, and their own profound terror of being wrong, just as fiercely as they were fighting the actual enemy on the battlefield.
Yeah.
It is a massive, violent collision of deeply held, completely incompatible realities, and a fractured coalition running on that much cognitive dissonance cannot sustain itself forever.
Which brings us to the macrostructural view of the era. Because with so many conflicting motives and fragmented inner worlds, the intense unifying spark of the First Crusade was inevitably going to burn out. The systems of belief and logistics eventually had to fracture under the strain of time.
This is where we look at the arc of erosion. The source text makes a point that completely reframes how I think about this history. The Crusades weren't just an event. They were an era. They span nearly 200 years.
And that sheer duration is critical to understanding the systemic failure. 200 years means no single generation experiences the entire arc.
People are born and die inside this war.
Exactly. The people who responded to Pope Urban's call in 1095 believed they were participating in something entirely unique, urgent, apocalyptic, and finite. They believed they were bringing about the end of days. But their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren inherited a war that had lost its apocalyptic sheen.
It became normal.
It had become ambiguous, heavily bureaucratic, and almost habitual, a normal part of the geopolitical background noise.
The text divides this massive 200-year span into 5 distinct phases, mapping the emotional and structural shift of the movement from absolute certainty to absolute exhaustion. Phase 1 is the ignition in 1095, culminating in the miraculous, brutal, and historically unexpected capture of Jerusalem in 1099.
The peak of certainty.
For the Crusaders who survived the march and took the city, the feeling is absolute, blinding certainty. Against all logistical odds, they won. It feels like empirical proof of divine alignment. God willed it, and it happened.
But that euphoric certainty immediately collides with reality in Phase 2, moving into the early 1100s. The Crusaders have established their new states in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, but now they have to govern.
Which is way harder than conquering.
They have to defend massive borders with vanishingly small numbers of Western troops. The apocalyptic zeal fades, and the reality of a logistical nightmare sets in. The emotional tenor shifts from ecstatic triumph to chronic anxiety and desperate maintenance.
And then comes Phase 3 in the mid-1100s. The geopolitical landscape shifts entirely. The fragmented Muslim powers we discussed earlier begin to consolidate, leaders emerge who unify the factions under the banner of jihad, and the momentum swings violently.
The Battle of Hattin.
Yes. In 1187, the Crusader armies suffer a catastrophic, systemic defeat at the Battle of Hattin by the forces of Saladin. The Christian army is effectively annihilated, and Jerusalem is recaptured by Muslim forces.
The psychological impact of Hattin cannot be overstated. It was a profound shock to the European epistemic closure. If the victory in 1099 proved that God was on their side, what did the total destruction of their army and the loss of the Holy City in 1187 mean?
It breaks the narrative.
It shattered the absolute certainty of Phase 1, plunging the movement into deep disorientation.
Which sets the stage for Phase 4 moving into the early 1200s. The text calls this the rupture, and it is the moment where the wheels completely and spectacularly fall off the wagon. I'm talking about the Fourth Crusade in 1204.
Oh, the Fourth Crusade.
This was supposed to be a massive campaign to sail directly to Egypt, strike the heart of Muslim power, and retake Jerusalem. But instead, the Crusader army diverts and completely sacks, loots, and burns the Christian city of Constantinople. How does an army raised to fight for God end up burning down the largest, most magnificent Christian city in the world?
It is the ultimate case study in logistical failure overriding ideological intent. The mechanics of the Fourth Crusade are a disaster of planning. The Crusader leaders contracted with the Republic of Venice to build a massive fleet to transport their army.
Right.
But when the departure date arrived, only a fraction of the expected Crusaders showed up, which meant they only had a fraction of the money to pay the Venetians.
So they're immediately trapped in massive debt to Venice before they even set sail.
Exactly. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, essentially says, "We bought the ships, you owe us the money. But you can pay off part of your debt by helping us conquer the rebellious city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast."
But Zara was a Catholic city.
It was. The Pope explicitly forbade the attack and threatened excommunication, but the Crusaders, trapped by their debt and logistical dependency, attacked it anyway.
The system is already corrupting its own rules to survive.
And from there, it spirals further. A deposed Byzantine prince offers to pay off the rest of their Venetian debt and fund their campaign to Egypt if they will just sail to Constantinople and help him reclaim his throne.
They just keep doubling down.
Again, driven by logistical desperation, the promise of wealth, they agree. But once they install him, he can't pay. Tensions explode, the Crusaders are stranded outside the walls without supplies, and the result is the brutal sack of Constantinople in 1204.
It is one of the most glaring historical examples of a movement completely betraying its own foundational premise. The original army of 1095 was raised specifically to defend Eastern Christians and reclaim holy sites. A century later, a Crusader army destroys the capital of Eastern Christianity, slaughters fellow Christians, and loots ancient relics, entirely for wealth, political leverage, and the desperate need to pay off shipping debts. It reveals the complete internal contradiction of the movement. The war loses every ounce of its moral clarity.
And that fatal loss of moral clarity leads into Phase 5. The remainder of the 13th century is a slow, agonizing dissolution. The subsequent Crusades become increasingly political, heavily taxed, and largely ineffective. It is just fatigue and fading conviction, ending with the fall of the last major Crusader stronghold, the city of Acre, in 1291.
Think of this 200-year slide like a multi-generational family business.
I like this.
The founders, the first Crusaders, started with this burning, passionate, almost irrational ideology. They work 80-hour minutes, they believe entirely in the mission, they take huge, foolish risks, and by sheer luck and timing, they succeed wildly.
Yeah.
But by the time the grandchildren and great-grandchildren inherit the company, the original passion is totally gone. The market has changed. The company has become a bloated, hollow, confusing bureaucracy. The descendants are just going through the motions to maintain their inherited market share, constantly fighting over internal budgets and department turf, until finally, the company just quietly goes bankrupt. The crusading movement transformed from an urgent, passionate response to a hollow pattern of recurrence.
Structurally, that is exactly what happened. The systems under stress, the social fabric, the political alliances, the economic engines simply began to fail. The early, miraculous collective unity of Christendom fractured the moment the external momentum stalled. All those old pre-Crusade class tensions and personal geopolitical agendas violently resurfaced.
It all came back.
The papacy's moral authority steadily weakened as the outcomes of the campaigns became inconsistent and politically motivated. The war shifted from an engine of economic opportunity for the landless to a crushing, utterly unsustainable logistical tax burden on Europe.
And what I find fascinating is how the institutions tried to manage this systemic collapse. They used information as a weapon to try and hold the failing system together. Communication back then was incredibly slow. A major battle happens in Syria, and it takes months for the surviving messengers to reach the courts of France or the Pope in Rome.
Which means there is no real-time clarity. The populace is entirely dependent on the institutional authorities to tell them what is happening. By the time the news arrives, the events are immediately filtered, interpreted, and spun by the clerical hierarchy.
Medieval PR.
Essentially, yes, the institutions have to maintain public morale and justify the continued massive expenditure of human lives and silver. So when a devastating defeat happens, the narrative engineers go to work. A massive loss is never framed as a failure of royal logistics or a blunder of military strategy.
What do they say?
It is spun as a profound test of faith. God is testing the resolve of the believers. Or it is blamed on the internal sins of the European populace. We lost Jerusalem because you were not pious enough.
That framing is crucial. It keeps the momentum going and redirects the anger away from the leaders, even when the reality on the ground is completely falling apart. But eventually, even the best theological spin can't hide the truth. The system sustaining the war, the collective belief, the political unity, the sheer economic logistics, permanently lost alignment. The Crusader era didn't end with one dramatic cinematic defeat where the last knight falls. It just faded away because the system lost its internal coherence.
It proves a very harsh, enduring historical lesson. Ideological triumph and religious zeal rarely, if ever, cancel out the physical, gravity-bound realities of a logistical burden.
So the physical project in the Levant essentially closes in 1291. When the dust finally settles on 2 centuries of bloodshed, we have to look at the final tally. Who actually won, and what did it truly cost?
The scoreboard.
Right. But the text forces us to look past what it calls a shallow scoreboard of who held which city in what year. First, it requires us to debunk some massive, pervasive myths that still color our understanding of the era.
The myths are incredibly stubborn. The text explicitly states that we must stop viewing the Crusades as purely defensive wars. Yes, the Byzantines initially asked for help, but the subsequent campaigns quickly mutated into expansive, colonizing, and coercive projects.
They weren't just protecting borders.
No. And they were also not exclusively focused on Jerusalem. As we discussed, the exact same crusading mechanism and indulgences were used against pagans in the Baltic region and heretics in southern France.
Furthermore, they were not a clean clash of unified civilizations. We've established how deeply fractured both sides were. And perhaps most importantly, the text warns against mapping modern political frameworks onto medieval realities.
You can't do it.
You cannot analyze the Crusades using the modern concepts of the nation-state, nationalism, or secularism. Imposing our modern categories on medieval people who viewed the world entirely through the lens of faith and feudal obligation is a massive failure of historical rigor.
So if we discard the myths, we can look clearly at who actually benefited. Territorially, the gains in the Middle East were incredibly fragile and ultimately entirely lost. The Crusader states were wiped off the map.
So not the knights.
But structurally and institutionally, some entities made out incredibly well. The papacy, despite the later failures, successfully demonstrated that it could mobilize massive armed forces across multiple sovereign regions, effectively fusing religion and geopolitical governance on an unprecedented scale. They created the architectural blueprint for institutional power.
And we can't forget our opportunists, the Italian maritime cities. Venice and Genoa extracted highly durable commercial wealth. They established trading networks, monopolies, and shipping routes across the Mediterranean that enriched their republics for centuries after the last crusader left Acre.
But here is the heartbreaking, enduring reality of systemic violence that the text highlights. Wars do not distribute outcomes evenly. The people who bore the absolute deepest costs of this 200-year endeavor, the freezing peasants, the terrified foot soldiers, the displaced Syrian civilians, the massacred Jewish communities, the urban poor heavily taxed to fund the armies, they rarely, if ever, banked the gains. The beneficiaries were the clerical elites who consolidated authority and the mercantile powers who secured monopolies.
And the true costs are staggering. There's the obvious human cost, the hundreds of thousands of battlefield deaths, the rampant disease, the massacres of cities upon capture. But the text focuses on a deeper trauma. It highlights the intimate deformation of daily life, the chronic famine caused by marching armies stripping the land, the violently displaced identities, the broken, erased memories of local communities that simply vanished under the tread of the holy wars.
We also have to consider the immense opportunity cost. Think of the staggering volume of resources poured into centuries of constant campaigning.
All that silver and iron.
The vast forests felled to build fleets, the iron mined and forged into tens of thousands of armor suits, the sheer tonnage of gold and silver extracted from the European economy to fund mercenaries and supply lines. What if all of that energy, all that wealth, had been invested in agricultural resilience
Or local infrastructure.
or developing diplomatic and trade relations? War isn't just measured by what is violently destroyed.
Yeah.
It's also measured by the peaceful human development that is systematically prevented from ever happening.
But the cost I am really struggling with, the one that feels like the heaviest part of this entire document, is the moral cost. Because it's one thing to destroy a physical city with siege engines. A city can be rebuilt, walls can be repaired.
Right.
But it is another thing entirely to structurally alter the psychology of a society so deeply that it learns to, as the text says, call cruelty good. When a culture successfully folds extreme brutality into its definition of righteousness, that creates a profound moral hangover that lasts for centuries. How exactly did that moral cost influence the centuries of history that followed?
The long-term systemic consequences are profound and largely tragic. The Crusades entrenched a deep, lasting estrangement and mutual suspicion between Eastern Orthodox and Western Latin Christianity that still echoes today.
Wow.
They normalized and legally entrenched anti-Jewish violence in European culture, setting horrific precedents for the centuries that followed. But most critically, they created an enduring symbolic technology.
A symbolic technology.
Yes. Even after the medieval context vanished, even after the specific kingdoms and popes were gone, the rhetoric of holy war, the language of absolute righteous sanctified violence remained. It was a tool that had been successfully invented and beta tested.
And people kept using it.
That rhetoric was subsequently weaponized by later empires, by colonial movements, and by modern nationalist projects. The concept of the crusade, the idea that a group can achieve violent purification against a sacred enemy, became a permanent, highly accessible part of the human cultural toolkit.
So the victory, for those incredibly few elites who actually achieved it, was deeply morally compromising. And the loss for the countless local communities in the Middle East and Europe who were caught in the crossfire meant learning a profound traumatic resilience just to survive. The text summarizes it perfectly. We must be careful not to mistake the immediate spectacle of a historical event for its lasting consequence.
That is precisely the lesson. And that warning brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most unique section of this source document.
Yeah, the document ends in a way I entirely didn't expect. After pages of macroanalysis, economic theory, and grand theology, it takes a hard left turn into a highly unique, almost literary thought experiment.
It's very striking.
It drops the wide-angle historical lens and asks us to view the entire trauma of the Crusades through a specific subpersonality lens. The author introduces a persona called Tira.
It's a deeply effective psychological approach. In psychological theory, a subpersonality is a part of the human mind that holds specific traits, perspectives, or coping mechanisms to deal with complex realities. The author asks us to imagine placing this specific persona, Tira, directly into the physical and emotional reality of the Crusades. Tira represents the archetype of the witness and weaver.
She is not a king negotiating treaties. She's not a knight swinging a heavy sword on the front lines. She doesn't have the agency to start or stop the violence. She exists on the absolute margins of the grand narrative.
Exactly.
You have to imagine her as a scribe cataloging supplies, or just a quiet listener sitting by the fire in a muddy crusader camp. She is the person who notices the quiet, agonizing contradictions that everyone else in the system is either too busy or too fiercely, violently certain to question.
In a rigid system that demands absolute alignment, where the cognitive dissonance of the participants is pushed to the absolute breaking point by the horrors of starvation and combat, the Tira persona operates as the quiet conscience. She observed the profound disconnect between the holy rhetoric and the bloody reality, and she asks a devastating internal question. If faith demands the innocent fall, is it faith at all?
If faith demands the innocent fall, is it faith at all? It is a question that completely punctures the armor of epistemic closure. I have to synthesize this with an analogy because the function of this persona is vital. Think of the Tira persona like the black box on a commercial airplane.
A flight data recorder.
Exactly. The black box doesn't fly the airplane. It doesn't get to decide the destination or the altitude, and it certainly doesn't cause the plane to crash, but it is specifically designed to survive the catastrophe.
Right.
Its only job, its sacred duty, is to silently and objectively record the exact systemic failures. It records the blaring alarms, the pilot errors, the structural stress, so that when the wreckage is finally cleared away, the actual truth of what brought the plane down isn't erased or spun by the airline's public relations department.
That is a phenomenal way to understand her role. The black box holds the objective data that the dominant victorious narrative might desperately want to hide or obscure. The Tira persona engages in a profound act of quiet resistance.
She just watches.
She doesn't fight the holy war with a sword. She fights it by noticing. She fights by remembering. She protects the jagged parts of meaning, the uncomfortable truths that refuse to fit neatly into the victor's triumphant, sanitized narrative.
She is the one who notices how the exact same system of belief can provide profound, genuine comfort to a dying soldier whispering a prayer in the dirt, while simultaneously being used to justify the absolute slaughter of an entire village just over the hill. She holds the paradox.
And the author argues that her role is essential for our survival. In a world that is constantly gravitationally pulled towards sharper categories, toward martial certainties, and the comforting amnesia of epistemic closure, holding on to complexity is a radical act. Refusing to flatten the messy tragedy of history into a simple, binary fairy tale of who was completely right and who was completely wrong isn't just an academic exercise. It is an act of deep intellectual rigor and vital moral conscience.
And that profound thought brings us to the end of our journey today. Let's synthesize this entire autopsy for the listener.
Let's do it.
Our deep dive into the Crusades.pdf wasn't really a lesson about the tensile strength of chainmail, or the engineering of siege towers, or memorizing the specific dates a desert city changed hands. It was a rigorous masterclass in the vulnerability of human psychology.
Absolutely.
It was about recognizing the terrifying historical moment when systems built to defend a truth mutate into violent machines that rigidly police who belongs and who is marked for destruction. It is an exploration of how localized social pressure, fractured political chaos, and the alluring promise of absolute ideological certainty can combine to make the unthinkable seem entirely reasonable.
And as we conclude, we must reiterate our foundational boundary. Our goal today was strictly impartial exploration. We've discussed deeply sensitive religious concepts, historical atrocities, and enduring cultural traumas.
We have.
But we're not endorsing the specific theological or political viewpoints analyzed in the text, nor are we taking sides in these ancient, complex conflicts. We are simply analyzing the profound structural and psychological mechanics the source material presents to better understand human behavior.
We are studying the blueprint of the machine, not passing judgment on the specific individuals trapped inside it. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to carry with you.
The source text concludes with a powerful provocation.
Mm-hmm.
It asks us to stop endlessly litigating the medieval era, to stop wondering which side was ultimately right in 1099 or 1187, and instead to turn that analytical lens squarely on ourselves.
Okay, what does it ask?
It asks, look closely at the world around you today. What kind of world is created when people become certain enough to make sacred things bleed?
Wow.
So I pose this directly to you. Where in your own life, in your local communities, or in our broader modern society, do you see the dangerous, alluring comfort of unquestioned certainty? Where are we currently flattening the beautiful, methy complexity of human existence into rigid binaries of pure and condemned?
It is the ultimate question we have to grapple with, because if we aren't careful, if we lose that intellectual rigor, we fall right back into those diagnostic muddy waters we talked about at the very beginning. We start desperately looking for that clean, jagged line on the X-ray, demanding a simple binary of broken or not broken, entirely good or entirely evil.
And that's dangerous.
And when we demand that level of absolute simplicity from a profoundly complex world, we risk rebuilding the exact same machines that generated the darkest parts of our history. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the hard questions, keep holding on to the nuance, and please sit with the tension of complexity. We will catch you on the next one.